5. Psychoanalytic work has shown us that it is precisely these frustrations of sexual life which people known as neurotics cannot tolerate. The neurotic creates substitutive satisfactions for himself and his symptoms, and these either cause him suffering in themselves or become sources of suffering for him by raising difficulties in his relations with his environment and the society he belongs to. The latter fact is easy to understand. The former presents us with a new problem, but civilization demands other sacrifices besides that of sexual satisfaction. We have treated the difficulty of cultural development as a general difficulty of development by tracing it to the inertia of the libido, to its disinclination to give up an old position for a new one. We are saying much the same thing when we derive the antithesis between civilization and sexuality from the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two individuals in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization depends on relationships between a considerable number of individuals. When a love relationship is at its height, there is no room left for any interest in the environment. A pair of lovers are sufficient to themselves, and do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. In other cases, does Eros so clearly betray the core of his being, his purpose of making one out of more than one. But when he has achieved this in the proverbial way through the love of two human beings, he refuses to go further. So far, we can quite well imagine a cultural community consisting of double individuals like this, who, libidinally satisfied in themselves, are connected with one another through the bonds of common work and common interests. If this were so, civilization would not have to withdraw any energy from sexuality. But this desirable state of things does not, and never did, exist. Reality shows us that civilization is not content with the ties we have so far allowed it. It aims at binding the members of the community together in a libidinal way as well, and employs every means to that end. It favors every path by which strong identifications can be established between the members of the community, and it summons up uninhibited libido on the largest scale so as to strengthen the communal bond by relations of friendship. In order for these aims to be fulfilled, a restriction upon sexual life is unavoidable, but we are unable to understand what the necessity is which forces civilizations along this path and which causes its antagonism to sexuality. There must be some disturbing factor which we have not yet discovered. The clue may be supplied by one of the ideal demands, as we have called them, of civilized society. It runs, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." It is known throughout the world and is undoubtedly older than Christianity, which puts it forward as its proudest claim. Yet it is certainly not very old. Even in historical times, it was still strange to mankind. Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as though we were hearing it for the first time. We shall be unable then to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. Why should we do it? What good will it do? What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? My love is something valuable to me, which I ought not to throw away without reflection. It imposes duties on me, for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. I leave out of account the use he may be to me, and also his possible significance for me as a sexual object, for neither of these two kinds of relationship comes into question, where the precept to love my neighbor is concerned. He deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him. And he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own self in him. Again, I have to love him if he is my friend's son, since the pain my friend would feel if any harm came to him would be my pain too. I should have to share it. But if he is a stranger to me, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own or any significance that he may already have acquired for my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. Indeed, I should be wrong to do so, for my love is valued by all my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on a par with them. But if I am to love him with this universal love merely because he too is an inhabitant of this earth, like an insect, an earthworm, or a grass snake, then I fear that only a small modicum of my love will fall to his share, not by any possibility as much as, by the judgment of my reason, I am entitled to retain for myself. What is the point of a precept enunciated with so much solemnity if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? On closer inspection, I still find difficulties. Not merely is this stranger in general unworthy of my love, I must honestly confess that he has more claim to my hostility and even my hatred. He seems not to have the least trace of love for me, and shows me not the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me, nor does he ask himself whether the amount of advantage he gains bears any proportion to the extent of harm he does to me. Indeed, he need not even obtain an advantage. If he can satisfy any sort of desire by it, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, and showing his superior power. And the more secure he feels, and the more helpless I am, the more certainly I can expect him to behave like this to me. If he behaves differently, if he shows me consideration and forbearance as a stranger, I am ready to treat him in the same way, in any case and quite apart from the precept. Indeed, if this grandiose commitment had run, Love thy neighbor as thy neighbor loves thee, I should not take exception to it. And there is a second commandment, which seems to me to be even more incomprehensible and arouses still stronger opposition in me. It is, Love thine enemies. If I think it over, however, I see that I am wrong in treating it as a greater imposition. At bottom, it is the same thing. I can now hear a dignified voice admonishing me. It is precisely because your neighbor is not worthy of love, and is on the contrary your enemy, that you should love him as yourself. I then understand that the case is one of that of credo quia absurdum. It is now very probable that my neighbor, when he is enjoined to love me as himself, will answer exactly as I have done, and will repel me for the same reasons. I hope he will not have the same objective grounds for doing so, but he will have the same idea as I have. Even so, the behavior of human beings shows differences, which ethics, disregarding the fact that such differences are determined, classifies as good or bad. So long as these undeniable differences have not been removed, obedience to high ethical demands entails damage to the aims of civilization, for it puts a positive premium on being bad. One is irresistibly reminded of an incident in the French Chamber when capital punishment was being debated. A member had been passionately supporting its abolition, and his speech was being received with tumultuous applause, when a voice in the hall called out, Que messieurs les assassins commencent. The element of truth behind all this, which people are so ready to disavow, is that men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, and who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. Who, in the face of all his aggressiveness, who, in the face of all his experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion? As a rule, this cruel aggressiveness waits for some provocation, or puts itself at the service of some other purpose, whose goal might also have been reached by milder measures, in circumstances that are favorable to it. When the mental counterforces which ordinarily inhibit it are out of action, it also manifests itself spontaneously, and reveals man as a savage beast, to whom consideration towards his own kind is something alien. Anyone who calls to mind the atrocities committed during the racial migrations or the invasions of the Huns, or by the people known as Mongols under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, or at the capture of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, or even, indeed, the horrors of the recent World War, anyone who calls these things to mind will have to bow humbly before the truth of this view.